Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of people, even seasoned English speakers, kind of trip up on sometimes. And these are called modal verbs.
Yeah.
These little words that can make a big difference to the meaning of a sentence.
Hmm.
And some examples are can, should, and might.
Right.
So I'm really excited to kind of unpack these a little bit today and see, get your take on them.
Sounds good.
I know in the past I've definitely been guilty of some modal verb mix-ups.
Yeah.
I think one time I told my friend I must not go to their party when I really meant I could not go.
Oh, no.
It was very awkward.
Yeah,
So I think we've all been there.
definitely.
So for those listening who maybe aren't familiar with these modal verbs, what are they and why should we care about them?
So modal verbs they add a nuance or a shade of meaning to another verb that it's attached to.
Okay.
So, like you're painting a picture and you can add like a shade or a tone to it.
Right.
That's kind of what a modal verb does for a verb. And so it allows you to show possibility or obligation or permission and things that you just can't do with normal verbs.
Right.
And so what's really fascinating about them is there's only 9 main modal verbs.
Okay.
But the way you can use them is actually really complex.
So they're small but mighty.
Yeah, they're really powerful little words.
That makes me even more curious now about them.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key rules we should keep in mind when we're using them?
Well, one thing to remember is that a modal verb is always followed by the base form of another verb.
Okay.
So you would say, you should study modal verbs, not you should study or you should studying.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's followed by the base form.
So it's kind of like the modal verb's the boss.
Yes.
And the other verb has to just follow suit.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Okay, they have to follow the rules of the modal verb.
Okay.
Another interesting thing is that they don't change form for different tenses.
Hmm.
So whether it's present or past or future, the modal verb itself stays the same.
Okay.
There are a few exceptions, like could can sometimes be used in the past tense for can, but most of the time they just stay the same.
Okay. So that's helpful, at least.
Yeah,
We don't have to
yeah.
think about conjugating them or anything like that.
Exactly. It's one less thing to worry about.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
So we've got the base form and the consistent tense.
Mhm.
What else?
The other important thing to remember is how to make a modal verb negative, because they're what's called an auxiliary verb. You just add not to make it negative. So can becomes cannot, or can't. Would becomes would not or wouldn't,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah. Those negatives I feel like are always a bit tricky for me.
Yeah.
But, okay. So why are these modal verbs so important? I mean, we don't really think about them consciously when we're using them most of the time.
Right. They're just kind of woven into how we speak and express ourselves. But when you think about it, if you want to ask permission or give advice or express certainty or doubt or even just talk about possibilities,
Yeah.
modal verbs are what you need to do all of those things.
Wow. So it's actually kind of amazing how much they do, even though we don't realize it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of times.
So if there's only 9 main ones, how can they express all of those different meanings?
That's a really good question. And so the thing about modal verbs is that each one can actually have many different meanings. And it kind of depends on the context of how it's being used.
Okay.
So for example, if you take the word can, you could use that to make a request. Like, can you look at something for me?
Yeah, like when my laptop is not working, I'm like, can you please help me?
Exactly. And then you can use can in a different way to express your ability to do something. So you might say, I can't do anything for a while.
Right.
You can also use it to talk about a general possibility, like older laptops can get like that.
Okay.
Or to express certainty it can't be a virus.
Okay.
And even to ask permission again, can I take it for an hour?
So all of those different meanings can be packed into that one little word, can.
Exactly.
Wow. I see why modal verbs can be a bit tricky.
Yeah.
So if someone's listening and they're feeling a bit overwhelmed,
Right?
what are maybe the top 3 things they should keep in mind about these modal verbs?
So one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is don't directly translate a modal verb
Okay.
into your own language because
Yeah.
they don't always have like a one-to-one meaning.
Right.
So that can kind of lead you down the wrong path.
Okay, so can in English is not the same can in Spanish.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Another thing is to pay attention to context.
Right.
Because we saw that can have so many different meanings. So how do you know which one it is? Well, you have to look at the words around it.
Okay, context is king.
Exactly. And the last thing is to remember that different meanings of the same modal verb can be completely unrelated.
Okay.
Like they're not connected.
Yep.
So it's kind of like having a multi-tool.
Okay.
Each function of that multi-tool is different, even though it's the same tool.
Right.
So if we take must, for example, you can use that to express certainty. It must be late. Or you can use it to give strong advice. You must read this article.
Okay.
So it's not that certainty slowly becomes advice. They're totally separate meanings
Okay.
that just happen to use the same word.
That's a good point, because I think I was always trying to connect all of the meanings.
Right?
And that's probably why I was getting so confused.
It's confusing. Yeah.
So speaking of confusing, there's this other category of words that can get mixed up with modal verbs.
Mm-hmm.
These are called semi-modal verbs.
Yes.
So what makes them different from the other modal verbs?
So they're kind of like modal verbs, but they don't always follow all of the same rules.
Okay.
And some common examples of these are have to, ought to, and had better.
Okay.
So these are all semi-modal verbs.
So are they basically interchangeable with modal verbs, or do they have different meanings?
So sometimes they can be interchangeable, like you can use will or be going to talk about certainty about the future.
Right, like it will rain tomorrow, or it's going to rain tomorrow. They're pretty much the same.
Exactly. But sometimes they have their own separate shade of meaning, and so an example of this would be supposed to.
Okay.
And so that implies an obligation that's put on you by someone else rather than by yourself.
Okay, so like I'm supposed to be there at 10, but maybe I don't want to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But someone else has said that you need to be there.
Whereas I should be there at 10 is like my own internal motivation.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
It's a very subtle difference.
Yeah, but it is very different.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been great. I feel like we've covered so much.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up part 1, I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about all these different modal verbs, but which one do you find the most challenging to use correctly?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
And why?
Yeah.
So I want to challenge our listeners to think about that, and we'll delve a little deeper into these tricky words in part 2.
Sounds good. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some time to think about your own modal verb struggles.
Me too. Honestly, since we started this deep dive, I feel like I can't stop noticing modal verbs everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think before we go too far down that rabbit hole, we should probably come back to those semi-modal verbs.
Yeah.
I have a feeling some of our listeners might be feeling a little lost.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to get bogged down with all the little details.
Yeah.
But, at the end of the day, the point is not to memorize all the rules and the exceptions. It's just to get a feel for how these words work in the real world.
Okay, that makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
So where should we start with these semi-modal verbs?
So we talked a little bit about have to in the last part. And
Yeah.
that one often expresses obligation or necessity.
Right.
And so it's similar to must, but have to is a little less formal. It's more for everyday conversation.
So like saying, I have to go to work versus I must go to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, but have to is just more casual.
Okay.
Another difference is that have to can be used in different tenses. Unlike must, so you can say, I had to go to work yesterday, or I've had to work late all week, and so on.
So have to is a little bit more flexible.
Exactly.
Okay, what about ought to? What's that one all about?
So ought to is interesting.
Okay.
It's often used for advice or a moral obligation,
Okay.
which is similar to should, but it has like a stronger sense of duty or correctness.
So if you said you ought to apologize for what you did,
Mm-hmm.
it's like you're saying it's not just a suggestion.
Exactly.
It's like the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. Yeah, there's a moral implication there
Okay, I see.
with ought to.
Now, had better, that one always sounds a little bit scary to me.
Yeah.
Like there's a threat behind it or something.
Yeah, you're right to pick up on that because had better is definitely the most forceful of the semi-modal verbs that we've talked about.
Okay.
And you use this one when you want to warn someone about the negative consequences of not doing something.
So it's like saying, you better do this or else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really implies that something bad is going to happen if you don't follow this advice.
Okay. Well, be careful using that one. I
Yeah.
don't want to threaten anyone accidentally.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I just want to make sure our listener doesn't think this is an exhaustive list of all the semi-modal verbs.
Right. There are definitely more out there.
Okay.
Like need to, dare to, and be able to. But for today, we're just focusing on these more common ones.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I kind of want to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
And talk about something I think a lot of language learners have trouble with, which is using modal verbs for politeness.
Yeah.
It's one thing to know the rules, but it's a whole other thing to know how to use them and sound natural.
Right. And to be appropriate.
Yeah, and not rude.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are some tips we can give our listeners to kind of help them with that?
So one of the most important things, I think, for politeness is to remember that could and would are usually considered more polite than
Okay.
can and will. When you're making requests or asking for permission.
So like, could you please pass the salt?
Yeah,
Sounds a lot nicer than, can you pass the salt?
exactly.
Okay.
And the same thing for, would you mind closing the window? That sounds better than, will you close the window?
Right.
Because you're kind of softening the request by using those words.
Gotcha. So could and would
Mm.
are our politeness all-stars.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, what else can we do to make sure we're not sounding rude?
You can also use may instead of can when you're asking permission,
Okay.
especially in formal settings. So instead of saying, can I use the restroom, you can say, may I use the restroom?
Right.
And it just sounds a little more respectful.
May I use the restroom?
Yeah.
Ooh, I like that. I'm
It
going to use that.
sounds very elegant.
It does.
Yeah.
But, it's not just about using the right modal verb.
Right.
It's also about your tone of voice.
Exactly.
You can say the most polite words in the world.
Yeah.
But if you're like rolling your eyes or something, it's not going to come across very well.
Exactly. It's all about the tone and the body language that you use.
Right. Okay, so it's all about congruence.
Yes.
Words and actions.
Exactly.
Okay, well, this has been a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too.
But remember, listener, the key to mastering any part of a language is practice
Mm-hmm.
and exposure to the language.
Yeah. The more you hear these things, the more you'll be able to use them yourself.
Yeah, just pay attention to how native speakers are using these things, and I think that's the best way to learn.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, before we wrap up part 2,
Okay.
I have another thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I like these.
So we've talked a lot about the different meanings of modal verbs.
Right.
But do you think there are any universal concepts or emotions that can't be expressed using modal verbs?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what are the limits of language?
Right. Are there things that we just can't put into words?
Exactly.
No matter how carefully we choose those words.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, food for thought.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be back in part 3 to wrap up our deep dive on modal verbs with some final thoughts.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on modal verbs.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I wanted to touch on one more thing that I think is particularly interesting for language learners.
Okay.
And that's how modal verbs have changed over time.
Right.
I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So language is constantly changing and evolving.
Right.
And modal verbs are no exception. So some of them that were once common have actually practically vanished.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, for example, shall used to be much more common,
Okay.
especially in formal settings.
Right.
But these days, you don't really hear it that much anymore.
No, not really.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned it in school,
Right.
but I don't think I've ever used it in real life.
Exactly. And will has basically taken its place.
Right.
And then there are some modal verbs that have actually taken on new meanings or nuances over time.
Okay.
So must, for example, used to be mainly about obligation or necessity.
Right.
But we saw that now it can also express certainty
Mhm.
or even strong advice.
It's amazing how the meanings can just subtly shift over time.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I think that's what makes language learning so challenging, but also so rewarding.
Right.
It's not just about learning a set of rules.
Mhm.
It's really about understanding the dynamic nature of language and how it reflects the world around us.
That's a really good point.
That-
It kind of makes language learning seem more like an adventure
Yeah, exactly.
that never ends.
Exactly. It's a continuous journey.
Yeah, I like that.
And modal verbs are a big part of that journey.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's safe to say that after these 3 parts, our listener is now ready to go on their own modal verb adventure,
I hope so.
armed with all the knowledge.
Yeah, and just remember, don't be afraid to experiment with them in your conversations. And the more you use them, the more comfortable you'll get with them.
Exactly. Practice
Mhm.
makes perfect, or at least progress.
Exactly.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive, I just want to leave our listener with one final thought.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the technical side of modal verbs,
Right.
all the rules and the different meanings and all of that.
Mhm.
But, at the end of the day, language is really about connecting with other people
Yeah,
and expressing yourself authentically.
exactly.
So don't get too caught up in all the rules and regulations.
Right. Just use them.
Yeah, just use modal verbs as tools to help you communicate.
Yeah, to connect with people.
Yeah.
Share your ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of English modal verbs, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Yeah, see you next time. Happy speaking, everyone.